setting.
So just a brief interlude really on pedal settings, because there's lots of things we can alter when we do surgery. We can alter gauge size, we can alter the vacuum and flow rate settings, the maximum and starting points, and we can also alter cut rate, although I generally virtually always use maximum cut rate all the time. But there's two other considerations I want to look at here, is the rate of change of cut and vacuum with pedal depression, and also separation of cut rate and flow rate, so with dual linear systems. And they're poorly understood, and I thought we'd spend a little bit of time talking about them. So this is actually a constellation screen, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about is common to all machines. Generally on a pedal, you can do a number of things when you cut. You can cut proportionally, which is the simplest thing. So as your foot goes down, your vacuum or your flow rate, whichever mode you're in, increases linearly, and your cut rate is fixed. That's proportional mode, and that's the commonest mode people use. You can also do things like momentary. So in that situation, your vacuum is linear on your pedal, and you kick the foot to the right and hold it to the right to activate cut. So for example, I use momentary for peripheral iridectomies. So as I vacuum down without cut on the pedal, when I've engaged iris, I kick my foot to the right, which engages the cutter. I use a cut rate of around about 100 cuts per minute, which gives you about 2 cuts a second, which gives you a nice controlled peripheral iridectomy. So just a little bit more about proportional. So when we use proportional, you could imagine having core settings separate from peripheral settings. So if you did a core vitrectomy for 25 gauge, you might want to use a maximum vacuum of, say, 550. And then from 0 to 550, that would be the full depression of the pedal. You could have any range of vacuums during that pedal. But you might want to have separate vacuum settings for peripheral vitrectomy where you want lower maximum vacuums. And obviously, if you reduce your maximum vacuum, you get more sensitivity on the pedal. The more you press down, the lower the change per unit time in the vacuum change. So some people would have a core setting for doing a core vitrectomy, and then a peripheral vitrectomy setting for doing peripheral vitrectomy to allow more sensitivity during your pedal. And I've shown some average vacuum settings. Those settings are for single action cutters. So that's the Alcon, for example, 5K, 7.5K, and 10K cutter settings. Now it's important to remember, as Tommaso pointed out, so these are typical duty cycle curves for single action cutters, where the higher your cut rate, the lower your duty action, and therefore the lower the flow with higher cut rate. And so therefore, people basically got less flow with higher cut rates. It didn't mean to say you should reduce your cut rates, but it's just you had to be aware of that fact. With dual action cutters, like the Alcon Hypervit and the Dork TDC cutter, the duty cycle doesn't change much with cut rates. So the duty cycle stays really high with high cut rates, meaning you don't get that reduction in flow with higher cut rates. And the significance of that, as I asked Tommaso about initially, was if you go from a single action cutter to a dual action cutter, to get the same flow rates, you need less vacuum. So roughly speaking, for most cutters, it's about 70% of the vacuum settings you need on dual action cutters compared to single action cutters to get the same flow rates. It varies by what media you're in, whether you're in BSS or vitreous, and what the vitreous viscosities are like, but it's more or less that sort of terms. So for example, on a 25 gauge with dual action cutters, you might want to use peripheral vitrectomy settings of a maximum 200 and a core of a maximum 400 if you want to achieve the same flow rates as you did with single action cutters. You might feel happy going to higher flow rates, but these were the settings if you're used to those flow rates on single action cutters. Now 3D does a number of things, and it enables you, for example, to combine core and peripheral modes in one foot pedal setting. So to get 3D on the Constellation, for example, and you can get this on all the machines now, I believe, 3D settings. So you have to select 3D by whichever means that is on your particular machine. Then you usually get a screen like this. And this is a little bit confusing to people, because the first range of settings is the end of your first range of your pedal depression. And the second settings are the end of the second range. And this is because when you go to 3D, you enable a thing called ramping. So it enables, you can choose how your pedal how those two ranges intermingle. So you can choose anywhere between the first half, the first bit of pedal depression is 0 to 15, and you can do right down to 0 to 90, then the last bit of the depression is 90 to 100. I choose to leave my pedal all the time on the transition point as 90%. So my first range on 3D is 0 to 90, and the second range is 90 to 100. And you'll probably have to ask your machine manufacturers how you do that, but it's relatively simple. Just a set of keying words into the command module. So that's what I use, 0 to 90 and then 90 to 100 for my ramping in 3D. And that's an example of the Alcon settings. So for example, if I was using an Alcon 10K cutter in 27 gauge, these are the sort of settings I might have for a combined peripheral and core mode settings. So the first 90% of the pedal is 0 to 400, keeping my cut rate on maximum. And then the second bit of the pedal rapidly accelerates the rate of change of vacuum rise from 400 to 650. And I use that last 10% for my core vitrectomy, and the first 90% for more controlled peripheral vitrectomy. Another useful tip is something you might say, well, how do you tell when you're at 90%? And something you can do is just very slightly change your cut rate at maximum cut rate to say like 9,500, which enables you to hear the change in sound when you know you're at 90%, and you know you're in that final rapid rate of change thing. So that's just a useful thing you can try thinking about and experimenting with that. And obviously the settings would be different for Hypervit 20K or TDC 16K, but they give you some idea of what you can do. Because you can use 3D and also in drop nuclei. In drop nuclei, you want an open duty cycle, a maximum open duty cycle with a low cut rate and high vacuum. So for example, on 3D for 25 gauge with a 5K Alcon cutter, you could have those settings where you have 0 to 650, so maximum vacuum on the first bit of the pedal depression, and then you drop your cut rate for the second bit of pedal depression to give you that wider open duty cycle to remove epinucleus and less dense nuclear material. So I use 3D settings quite often on drop nucleus. Another way of doing it is with dual linear control. First, I think initiated by Bausch & Lomb, but now available on several of the machines. And it allows linear control in both depression and sideways movement of the pedal. So as you move your foot down, you can have vacuum on linear downward, and then you can have linear cut rate to the right-hand side. And you can have vice versa. You can swip the control over. And again, people find it. Some people use it all the time. Many people use it for drop nuclei. One of the risks is you have to be very aware of the settings because you don't want to activate low cut rate with maximum vacuum, for example. But if you're used to it, it's a useful strategy to know about, which will give you some extra abilities. But it does require practice. So that's what I wanted to say about settings. Thank you very much. If anybody's got any questions I meant to say from the audience, very happy to have them while I'm going back to my chair. And if there's any questions from the panel as well.
So, David, a question.